Good afternoon. Our mayor is absent and excused. I call to order our first budget work session for the new fiscal year, and I will hand it over to our city manager for our first item, transportation public projects update.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem and members of council. Before we turn over to that first item, I do want to make just a couple of comments. First, I just want to say thank you for the willingness to participate in these 3 budget work sessions plus your retreat prior to the manager's recommended budget. These are opportunities for us to share important topics with you as we develop our recommended budget for your consideration. And while no formal direction or formal voting is needed, your feedback and direction helps us better reflect a budget that matches your priorities. At the end of the day, the budget we present in May will be balanced. Revenues equal expenditures. That's the way the rule works. And so our goal is to try to fit those priorities with the council's strategic plan and your interests with the available resources, and to have those 2 things come up. The other thing I just wanted to mention as a part of these work sessions, we are picking topics that have a high degree of interest for this particular budget, and those topics shift from year to year depending on various priorities, and so that's why you're going to hear us focus on these topics. But we also are happy to talk about other topics you may wish to try to discuss. So if there's something else that you would like information about, or presentations in the future, or a budget note as you're aware of, these work sessions are a great time to give us that feedback and we can get you information. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Vigue, our Budget Management Services Director, to get us started on the first topic.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Again, thank you for your attention and your time. Our first topic today is an update on our transportation capital projects. As you'll hear, this is especially a challenging time for us as we think about the construction market and some other issues. And so today they're going to provide you an update on where we are on several of those projects, some of the challenges we're facing as we go into the development of our CIP this year, and then what some of the next steps are. So I'll turn it over to Paul Callum.
Hey, thanks, Mary. Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem Branch and members of the council. I'm Paul Callum. I'm one of the Assistant Transportation Directors here with the City of Raleigh. And beside me is my colleague, Blair Hinkle. He is one of the Assistant Directors in the Engineering Services Department. Today, the Engineering Services and Transportation Department come together to give you a status update on the transportation capital projects. This presentation is being presented for informational purposes today, and there's no action needed from council today. Based on your feedback, we will bring some recommendations back to you in April. As we look at the agenda, I'll give you a brief overview of the project origins and some of the departmental relationships between engineering services and the transportation department. Kenneth Ritchie, who is our roadway design and construction manager in engineering services department, will be touching on some of the public engagement process, the real estate acquisitions, and the construction bidding climate, followed by some specific updates to our capital projects. Eric Lamb is our transportation manager. He will highlight some of the different bond programs, such as NCDOT project participation, the sidewalk program, public-private partnerships, neighborhood traffic management program, are just a few to name. And then we will end by touching on some of the emerging trends and gather, again, feedback from you and bring recommendations back to you if you so choose in April. So project origins here. Projects, basically multimodal projects, originate from several different areas. The comprehensive plan, we get feedback from residents and council requests, and then staff. Projects are scored based on criteria such as safety, congestion, some of our transit needs, our bike and ped demands, and then economic development. Just to highlight, back in the city council, as far as approved project priorities, they saw a 2013 bond for $75 million, and then most recently in 2017 a $206.7 million bond in 2017. And then, of course, projects and funding allocations come to you, and they're reviewed annually through the CIP and budget review process. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about departmental relationships. So as you can see here, the two bubbles, historically, the Transportation Department has gone in and identified these multimodal projects. We usually prioritize the project based on criteria, as I mentioned earlier, safety, congestion, bike and ped demands, transit needs, and things of that nature. Then we in transportation would typically prepare some of the preliminary cost estimates for these projects. And then we consult with our engineering services partners on the design and scope of the projects, and then we play a part in the design, in the selection of the design firms. We then, as my staff says, and I'll say it here, so I do not like the word handoff. It kind of feels like I'm giving something up and giving it to someone else. So I like the word transition. We like to stay engaged on this. So we basically transition these projects over to the engineering services department. And then the engineering service department, as you can see on your far right, some of the things that they would typically have as far as responsibilities is design management, and then look at the acquisition oversight with construction management and infrastructure acceptance. So I know a lot of the council members a lot of times will, Michael Moore will ping me and said, hey, one of the council members wants to find out something going on about a particular project. So this kind of highlights what the transportation department would traditionally do, and then how we would transition those over to the engineering services department, especially in the roadway design and construction group. So it's kind of like I tell people in a golf game, we kind of tee the ball up in transportation, engineering services drives it down the field and basically tries to, or I shouldn't say try, gets a project to completion here. So that's kind of the roles here that I think it's important for the council to see. So now I'm going to turn this over to Kenneth Ritchie, again with the Engineering Service Department, to touch on a few of the public engagement process, the real estate and construction bidding.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. Kenneth Ritchie, roadway design and construction manager with the City of Raleigh Engineering Services Department. Part of what I'm going to go through in a discussion on the project updates and status is kind of highlight three kind of key parts of that delivery process, and then we'll kind of get into the status update of our current projects. So public engagement is a big component of our transportation capital projects. The process that is highlighted here is our process for our more traditional, larger capital roadway projects. And as you can see, based off of this timeline, typically from the time that we move forward with design consultant selection through to construction bid is typically a 22 to 24 month period, highlighted with many touch points with the community. One in particular that I do want to highlight is the advanced design stage, the 65% stage. That is a 2-point touch. There is the public meeting, and then there is a presentation to the council to update on the status of the design and any direction the council may have before we move into the right-of-way acquisition stage. As I'll touch on in the next couple slides, two key elements of this process are the real estate acquisition, and certainly some of the trends we're seeing with real estate acquisition, and then the construction bidding. With real estate acquisition, traditionally that has not started until the 65% stage, which is here, and typically that can be anywhere from a 9 to 12 month period from that point. We are working with our real estate group right now to pilot a process where they are now engaging during the early design, 25% stage, to start engaging with property owners. Just to start the conversation in the hopes that the parallel processes will help make the process a little bit more efficient coming out of that 65% stage. Another piece that we really have started to put together is a toolkit of how we really engage the public. We want to make sure that we're engaging as many of the citizens that are impacted by these projects as early in the process as possible. Certainly I've highlighted the public meetings. Mailed notifications is one process that we've really started to engage in more. We have started a new process with each public meeting where there's really 3 postcards that go out. We're sending out a save the date card 30 days in advance just so we can get it on people's calendars. We then send another notice out 2 weeks in advance just to remind them. And then we are following up post-meeting with a card that has a QR code on it to take them to our online survey so they can provide us feedback at the different meetings and the different design stages of the process. Resident surveys is another piece that we're really trying to highlight. The design process, we have those, and we're really starting to get into the point of post-construction resident surveys so that we can kind of get feedback with regards to the service and their experience during that process. Web pages and social media are another big point of priority for us, really trying to make sure we're using all the outlets possible to connect with the residents and being able to give them as much information as quickly as possible regarding upcoming opportunities for feedback. So part of working through this is the real estate acquisition that comes with right-of-way and easements necessary to build the projects that we have. Part of what the challenge has been, as with a growing city, has been the market changes with regards to property values and then property cost. The first 4 projects on this list, which completed 2016 to 2019, would have originated in the 2012 to 2015 range. What we see from a trend standpoint there is typically the real estate portion of the budget, or of the actual project cost, we're somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. What we're seeing more recently and what we're kind of projecting out is that that is now increasing more to the 20 to 25% range. I do need to highlight that certainly the 4 projects that are starred, the future ones, those are estimates with some level of contingency built in, but certainly we are expecting that those costs, based off percentage of our project costs, are continuing to increase. And then the construction bidding climate. Certainly with a very hot housing market and construction market, trying to get competitive bidding can be a challenge. And certainly part of what we're trying to do is find strategic ways to make our projects more competitive from an appeal standpoint to the construction industry. One thing that we have noticed is certainly over the last decade is an increase in material cost. And in some cases, those material costs have almost doubled. The price for asphalt has increased from roughly $35 a ton to about $65 a ton over the last 10 years. And our concrete sidewalk, we've seen an increase from roughly about $25 a square yard to about $50 to $55 a square yard. And 2, the size of the projects that we see does have an impact with regards to the competitiveness of the bids that we're seeing. With some of our larger, and I'll highlight Fox Road, Yonkers, Tryon, and New Hope Church Road, some of those are our larger capital roadway projects. Where we have seen more bidders, we have seen the prices become more competitive and actually have come in under our engineer's estimate. Some of the smaller sidewalk projects, smaller streetscape projects, we're seeing less bids. Prices are coming in much higher for those. Part of what we're trying to do is strategically look at how we can package projects together to really try and make them appeal to a larger audience for the construction industry and try and get some of that more competitive bidding across the board. So now I'll kind of provide an update on the 20 identified larger capital projects that we have. This map kind of highlights the projects and the dispersion of those projects throughout the city. Certainly there is a good dispersion of that throughout the different areas of the city. And as we go through the next 3 slides, we have grouped them based off of kind of the stage they are in the process. The first 6 projects through Tryon Road are those that are in construction. The next group of projects, which goes through Carolina Pines Avenue, those are have gone into substantial design, or some are into right-of-way acquisition. And then the last grouping are those projects that are really just now kind of even getting to the point, or really in our pre-design stage. So these are the 6 projects that are currently in construction. Fox Road, our Blunt Person Corridor Improvements Phase 1, which was a road diet that added multimodal facilities to those 2 streets. Pleasant Valley, New Hope Church Road, Yonkers Road, and Tryon Road Part C. All of those are under construction, and we anticipate those completing no later than probably the spring of 2022. And certainly with those, where those have fallen with regards to cost have kind of been certainly fluctuating, but certainly with regards to Yonkers and Tryon, the last 2 that we have bid, we certainly have seen those come in competitive and have certainly tried to keep those within the current budget. One piece I do want to highlight, where you see the asterisk on these next 3 slides, those are projects where we have gone and acquired supplemental funding through various grant programs to try and extend the reach of the tax dollars that we have. So the next group of projects are those that are what I would say into substantial design. So they're past the 25% stage and getting to the point of 65 in right-of-way acquisition. This is highlighted by Pool Road, Old Wake Forest Road, Blue Ridge Road widening. There's Lumley Westgate Ebenezer Church bicycle and pedestrian improvements, the Blue Ridge Road bike and ped bridge project, Atlantic Avenue, Barwell Road, and Carolina Pines Avenue. Part of what we are projecting with these projects is challenges with regards to budget versus what our estimated total project cost is going to be. In some, we're estimating that gap is somewhere between 7 and 9 million, and part of that has been supplemented with Old Wake Forest Road, which just recently received approval through the Campo Executive Board for grant funding, and that will be coming to you at a future meeting for your approval and acceptance of that grant funding. And then the last group of our projects are the projects that are really kind of in the pre-design stage. These projects are those that we've really, within the last, I would say, quarter, have gotten the design consultants on board and really starting to get into design, or projects that will be forthcoming with consultant selections. I do want to highlight Six Forks Road and the West Street Extension project. We will have those consultant agreements on the March 3rd City Council agenda for your review and approval. Certainly with these projects, these are earlier in the process. We are projecting gaps with regards to the funding, especially for the first 3 projects. As we get into design on Six Forks and West, we'll be able to further tailor in what the projected cost will be. The projected funding gap here is roughly 9 to 11 million. I do want to highlight that certainly with this group and the previous group, given the stages, that there are contingencies that we have built into those costs, so there is some conservativeness in that number, but certainly trying to make sure that we're not underselling what it's going to cost to actually build these projects. And so in summary, with regards to the identified projects, what we're kind of projecting right now based off our best estimates is a funding gap of about 17.5 million, which is roughly about 9% of the total allocation.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So what do you propose to close the gap?
We are working right now closely with the Transportation Department to try and identify ways to close that gap. And certainly we are planning on bringing those recommendations back with the proposed CIP in April.
Question on the Rock Quarry Road A from Creech to Sunnybrook. If it was not part of the DOT project, where would it be in this scale?
It would be in that early design stage with
Okay. The 25%.
Yes, with the same group here.
That's a quick question back to the construction bidding climate. For those of us that are new on the council, talk to us a little bit about your bidding process. I'm just surprised that a few of these had so few folks that actually bid on these projects.
So whenever we advertise for bid, typically we're going to put them out 30 to 45 days, and we are required to have 3 bidders before we can open. If we don't get those 3 bidders, we do have to re-advertise, and at that point we can't open bids. But certainly I think part of what we're seeing with regards to the number of bidders is just with the construction companies, a lot of these work on our projects as well as DOT projects, as well as a lot of the private development projects. And certainly I think with a lot of what we were seeing previously with the larger DOT projects that were under construction, it was kind of chipping into some of the perennial players that we typically would see with regards to bidding.
Mayor Pro Tem, if I could add a comment, Mr. Knight, or does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. To Mr. Cox's point, perhaps at a different response level, ultimately we need to bring these projects back within budget. And so when we say we're working on it, we're looking at all kinds of various ideas, but remember, revenues have to equal expenditures. And so There are various methods for doing that. The council may recall that we had the same discussion about some of our park bond projects last year and ended up having to shift some scope and defer some projects in order to fund some overruns in some other projects. And so with these road projects, we will not be able to incrementally address a $17 million gap. So we're going to need to start thinking about making some changes in the CIP or adding significant revenue to this particular program. That's putting a little bit firmer spiel on what we're going to have to try to do. We're not proposing any specific changes today, but we're just giving you the heads up as we go through the budget process. That's likely what we're going to need to look at doing.
Okay.
Any other questions? So next, I will we'll transition to Eric Lamb, who will give a highlight of our programs.
Good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. My name is Eric Lamb. I am the Transportation Planning Manager with the city's Transportation Department. So the other half of this is our programmatic allocations that we make. We have a number of different programs, different pots. The largest one we have right now is our participation with NCDOT on projects that they have within our jurisdiction. And one of the things that we do to participate with them is look at paying for sometimes known as betterments, project scope elements that they wouldn't normally include as part of their project, but that we want to see. So the one that's the single biggest expenditure that we typically make has to do with sidewalks, and we look at including sidewalks as a part of every one of our projects. We expect that to be part of NCDOT's projects as well. Some of you may remember the recent discussions that we had about the Beltline improvement projects in Southwest Raleigh. In addition to sidewalk, there were some additional street improvements that were made, and then we talked about making some upgrades to the brick noise wall. So all of those costs are supplemental costs that the city has to cover, the delta on those costs, and that's where these funds come from. We have a number of projects that are in the pipeline right now, some of which include street improvements along the US 1 corridor between 540 and the town of Wake Forest. In that situation, we're looking at not just sidewalks, but actually funding some parallel street improvements. Similar conversation along Glenwood Avenue. One of the challenges with that particular program is the recent project freezes that NCDOT has implemented as a result of their cost considerations that they're having right now. So that will continue to be in flux. All of those negotiations with NCDOT come before the council in the form of a municipal agreement, so council has final say on what of those elements we include in those projects. As part of the 2017 transportation bond, the City Council identified a set aside of $4 million towards public-private partnerships. We recently completed the first of those with the Southeast Raleigh YMCA. The City Council elected to provide $1 million towards the street improvements associated with that project. And then we're having discussions right now with Highwoods about a sidewalk project along Highwoods Boulevard between Atlantic Avenue and Capitol Boulevard. The city has a Safe Routes to Schools program where we work with schools to look at making improvements to improve accessibility for biking and walking for kids. We have a project right now for Leesville, the Leesville Road school campus, which is high school, middle school, and lower school. That has some separate funding, but we're probably looking at about $175,000 coming from this $2 million that would go towards that project. One of the other areas that council identified as a priority was looking at corridor and area plan implementation. So the city on a regular basis goes through and develops corridor plans, area plans, and each one of those plans has a series of recommendations. So we have been working with planning department staff right now to go through all of the city's adopted corridor and area plans to look at all of the transportation project recommendations that were provided from each of those plans. And as you can imagine, there's quite a number. So we're looking at trying to develop a database of all of those planned improvements and then develop a methodology for which of those projects need to be prioritized as part of this bond program. And then for transit-related projects, the city set aside $7 million as a participation measure for the Wake Transit Plan. So as we go forward with developing the scope on the 4 major BRT projects, the idea behind this set aside was that we would look at side street improvements, things that were beyond the scope of the base of the BRT project. So the best example, for example, is looking at making stations more accessible on side streets and providing sidewalk connections, things that would be outside the scope of what the BRT project could cover as part of its base federal funding, but we can come in and pay for that delta to, much like we do with the DOT projects, and pay for a sidewalk run along a side street to make a neighborhood accessible to a transit station. So those needs will be developed incrementally as each one of the 4 major BRT projects goes forward. We are doing significantly better with spending on major corridor sidewalk projects. There's a total funding from this bond and previous bonds of $17.5 million available. We have worked with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission to look at updating prioritization on how we do sidewalks. There's about 200 projects that were identified as part of the most recent pedestrian program evaluation that we did. And again, we're looking at about a total of, if we're going to build that entire program out, of about $84 million. We have a similar approach with streetscapes, not quite as large of a project queue. The council allocated about $5 million from the last transportation bond. We have 48 projects identified as part of that. However, we think that some of our upcoming capital projects and the BRT projects are going to supersede, so that list is going to get shorter as part of the other capital projects funding, and so we'll have a better idea of where that stands once we get further down the line. Now, the petition sidewalk program is different from the corridor sidewalks in that the petition sidewalks are specifically developed for improving sidewalks within neighborhood areas. So that is on an on-demand basis. Residents can sign a petition to request the city evaluate and look at building sidewalks and retrofitting the neighborhoods that were built without sidewalks in the first place. And then we have our traffic calming program, again, about $7 million available right now from the current bond and previous bonds. We have about 120 different projects in the queue right now with an estimated $40 million worth of work. With regards to sidewalk implementation in general, sidewalks come from a variety of sources. We include sidewalks as part of all of those capital improvement projects that Kenneth talked about. We include sidewalks as the base part of the scope for all of those projects. Like I said before, whenever NCDOT is doing a project in our jurisdiction, we're partnering with them to include sidewalks on our projects as well. We've got the major corridor sidewalk projects. With streetscape projects, typically that we're not building a lot of new sidewalk, we're typically refurbishing sidewalks as part of those efforts, but there are occasions on which we do build some new sidewalk linkages as part of that. We have petition sidewalk projects, and then the one element that doesn't impact our capital program is private development. So as new private development, new subdivisions, new neighborhoods are constructed, the obligation is on the development community to provide those sidewalks as part of our street improvement standards. So as I mentioned, we've been working with the city's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission to take a look at how we prioritize sidewalk projects and streetscape projects. And the impetus on this was looking at trying to make transit a higher priority in the scoring for how we look at those projects. So one of the things we want to make sure that we do, and we're doing this with our capital program as well, as we're now developing the implementation of the Wake Transit program, we want all of our capital investments to complement that investment as well. So we'll be looking at bringing forward at a future work session a review of those priorities for the council's consideration. So as Kenneth already touched on, we're looking at about a 9% shortage, and in talking to the engineering staff, that's generally consistent with what we're seeing with other capital projects, so that gap of $15 to $20 million is not completely out of line in terms of what we're seeing for cost increases across the construction industry. As I mentioned, we've got about 200 projects in our queue for the sidewalk program. As of right now, as we've been looking at petition projects, we've been bringing petition projects before the city council, irrespective of the cost of the money that we have available. So right now, we have about $30,000 linear feet of project work that council has given us a green light for development that is currently unfunded. Now, as of right now, one of the things that we're seeing from a process and project development standpoint, from the point that City Council says to start designing a project to the time that we can get to construction, is about a 2-year program. So one of the things that we're interested in is looking at ways that we can accelerate project delivery and get that time shorter. Those constraints that we've got on our projects right now include the process that we use to develop projects, the available funding, and the staff resources, the pipeline of which we do the development and the project management. In talking about streetscapes, one of the things that we've got in the pipeline right now is that we have done bids for the P Street project. We are getting close to heading towards bid for Overland Road streetscape project. The P Street project came in significantly over budget. And so one of the things that we could do, we're anticipating based on our conversations with the engineering team on Oberlin and what the engineers' estimates are, that will also probably exceed the project budget as well. So we've got some options there as far as whether we scale the scope of those projects back, whether we decide to cancel one project and fund another project, or if we look at using some of the $5 million in streetscape funding that's available from the transportation bond. If we do that, that would likely use up a significant portion of that $5 million. So that's one of the trade-offs that we would talk about. And then, as we mentioned, traffic calming. As we've got major calming, major projects and minor projects, we have about 120 projects on our plate right now. So in terms of next steps, we've got a couple of consultant contracts that will be coming for you at the March 3rd meeting. The Six Forks Road Corridor Plan Implementation Project, Phase 1, from Rowan Street up to Lynn Road. And then the West Street Extension as we're moving forward. Again, that project, as we've talked about that before, that project is not fully funded. The money that we have from the transportation bond helps us cover a local match, but it allows us to get started on the design and position that project to be shovel-ready and eligible for federal grant funding. So we're moving forward with the design of that project, and that's the contract that'll be coming for you on March 3rd. And then in April, we'll be bringing forth an update on the Lumley Westgate Ebenezer Church Road Bike and Ped Improvement Project. There's been a lot of changes out in that area that we've been had some delays on that project to manage and adjust to those changes. There are more on the horizon, so we'll be talking about some of those challenges that we've experienced with that project. And then, as Kenneth said, we'll be looking at bringing some recommendations forward to you as part of the CIP development process in April.
Okay. Questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I have a question about the gap in funding. There was a comment that there are some, I guess, I don't want to say fluff, but contingency built in. Do we know how much of that is reflected in the 9% gap? Then the other question I have is, what steps are we taking looking forward to sort of get ahead of this issue in the future? So if we know that certain costs are ticking up, what can we do to be resilient and make sure that when we're funding projects in the future that we're minimizing a gap from appearing, or at least to as great of an extent?
I'll address the second problem, and I'll let Kenneth talk about the first one. So as my office develops the initial scoping and estimates for the projects, we're always looking to try and make sure that we're padding the estimates as much as possible. In this case, the market that we're in today, the increases in the marketplace and inflation costs outpace the inflationary buffers that we had included in our cost estimates. So again, we keep adjusting. The one silver lining, as I mentioned, the NCDOT cost not overruns, but the cost restrictions that DOT is under, is that freeze on the construction market has actually improved the environment a little bit. You notice the last two projects have actually come in under what the bids were. We've gotten more bidders on those projects, so the bidders are coming back to us. That was a big influence that DOT was putting so much work out on the street. We weren't getting as many bids on our project. So that competitive environment certainly does help us. But again, we keep constantly adjusting our cost estimation requirements, looking at adding in contingencies wherever we can and try and keep those estimates without being unreasonably high, because again, that would limit the ability to do new projects, but we're trying to be responsive to the marketplace.
With regards to the contingency, the average across the projects is probably roughly 25%. We have it kind of as a de-escalating scale of contingencies based off of how early or far we are into the project. Certainly those under construction, we do have a 10% contingency that we do hold in there throughout that project, and then once it's completed, then those funds certainly will be freed up for that. And certainly as we move some of the earlier projects through the design process, those contingencies will be brought down as we further hone in on those costs. Part of what we're trying to do is really a data collection, data analytics effort to really kind of get a better sense of where the market is with regards to the different items we have throughout construction and design, to really help us watch trends and be able to hone in our estimating moving forward.
Right, so just to follow up then, so that 9%, the 17 million, that's sort of, I hate to say this, almost like a worst case scenario.
Yes.
Okay.
Councilman Cox.
Yes, you indicated that one way to mitigate the gap is to transfer funds. And I'm wondering, what are the limitations in terms of transferring funds? Are we talking about transferring just within transportation projects, or are we talking about transferring from other funds into the transportation fund?
We would historically look first at transferring within transportation. So some of what we'll do is look at projects that are currently outstanding that can close where there have been savings. We talked a little bit about that earlier. We'll also look at projects in the future that potentially are just maybe in the early design phase to see if there's a need to delay or hold on to it for another future bond. We'll also look to see what they currently because they also do receive contributions from the general fund for other programs within transportation, if any of that can help bridge the gap. But no, council member, we usually stay within that area in terms of looking at that funding, especially considering a lot of this is bond funding that's tied to specific, whether it's transportation or parks or those pieces.
Okay, and, but is there anything that would prohibit us from transferring from other funds?
The funding source. So if it's for example, if it's a bond, a GO bond, it has to be used for the intent that it was voted on for.
Okay. And regarding delays, is there any advantage in delaying any of these projects? Not necessarily to another bond, but I know we have to use the bond money within a certain period of time,
Yes, sir.
but is there any advantage to delaying a year or two any of these projects?
And that's some of what staff is working with us on in terms of looking at, remember, it's a 5-year CIP. And so as a project gets further into design, as Kenneth indicated, we get a better idea of how much contingency we truly need. And so our focus will be on how do we balance this year one, talking about the year two in terms of what's outstanding and still in design. We still might have some shortfalls out there, but as we get closer and closer to where it's completed, we'll have a better idea how close we were to our estimate. And so that might be some savings too. So yes, kicking projects out 1 or 2 years may give us a better idea of where there's some savings there that we can do that project later. Did I
Okay.
say that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Counselor Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for the presentation, for the information, for the work you're doing, honestly, day in, day out. This is some really complicated stuff, and I'm glad we have experts on hand. One of the things I wanted to say is that I'm looking forward to the kind of stopgap measures y'all are looking to bring back as options during our budget process. The other thing I'm really interested in diving into as a council is more on the policy side of this. So to Councilmember Melton's point, looking forward, what kind of priority shift do we need to have, or conversations do we need to have around policies when we're thinking about the types of road widening projects we want to do, or sidewalk projects we want to do? I know, for instance, Charlotte just really shifted how they're doing sidewalk funding so that they're not doing petitioning, but rather it sounds like they're doing what BPAC might be bringing forward and thinking about how are we better connecting with sidewalks, kind of our priority areas from schools and parks to whatnot. So really interested in having that conversation moving forward and hoping BPAC will bring us some good stuff.
Counselor Buff.
Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I'm particularly excited to see the Six Forks Road Corridor implementation moving forward. This is a really important project for District A as Midtown transitions from being a pass-through area to a destination in itself. This will make it more friendly for pedestrians. So I'm really excited to see that project advancing. And I'm equally excited to see recommendations for addressing projected gaps during our process in April. But before we get to that point, it's my understanding we have some available 2/3 bond capacity. And I'm wondering if I could get a little more clarity on where that capacity is and what we might need to do to take advantage of making those funds available.
Yeah, I'll ask Allison Bradsher to come forward and respond to that.
While we're waiting, I just want to say thank you as well for the presentation. I didn't say that before I asked questions. Blanket thank you to everyone who's going to present today, in case I forget again.
Good afternoon, Allison Bradsher, Finance. Yes, to answer the specific question, we do have some capacity left in the 2/3 calculation, and that's a little over 4.8 million.
Thank you for that. And if I may follow up. The second part of that is I understand it's somewhat time sensitive in that if we were going to make those funds available, we'd have to take some action here shortly. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Could you lay out the process for us?
Yes, so just based on the procedural requirements, we were going to bring forward, or are going to bring forward on March 3rd, your next council meeting, essentially the first series of votes that need to happen to use that 2/3 capacity. So what we would need to know today is essentially the purpose and dollar amount of that 4.8 million that you would like to use. We can then work with bond counsel to have everything in order for the March 3rd date. There's one little caveat with that. There is a letter that was already sent to the, let me get it correct here, the Joint Legislative Committee on Local Government. That was a group that was formed back in 2011, and essentially we're required to send a letter in stating this is Raleigh's objectives, these are the purposes and dollar amount. That had a 45-day window, and that actually happened at the end of last week. However, we do know that other governments have sent in an amended letter, and that has essentially passed. So I do want to put that caveat out there, and again, all this is just backing up to calendar requirements from the LGC, which we do require approval from the LGC for this. But we believe that based on our conversations to date, we can make that happen with an amended letter. But we would need the dollar amount and purpose of the utilization of that additional 4.8 today. Not via a formal note or vote, excuse me, just an indication.
So I have a question concern around that. If we were to not authorize it for March 3rd, that means we missed this year's deadline, but would there be a new deadline next year?
Well, the way the 2/3 calculation is, it is the calculation that's done every year, and ultimately we are going to issue some of the GO this year, so we really won't have any additional capacity. So it's really a use it or lose it, and to date we've only used the 12.55 million of the 17 capacity.
Okay.
Mr. Branch, if I could, I can see some frowns, so if people are trying to understand what we're talking about, if I could just go back for a minute. You may recall last spring for the previous council members that every year as a part of the budget process coming up, and the one we're getting ready to do, we show you the calculation on 2/3 bonds. And so what are 2/3 bonds? That's debt capacity that is available under North Carolina law to reissue if you have retired 2/3 of a previous bond issue. Okay, so it's an additional capacity the state allows you to issue based on how much you've previously retired, right? And so the last year, that amount that we described to the council was right at about that 17-something million dollar number. And as a part of the budget process, we recommended the 12.5 and left 4.9 sort of available for things that might arise from last year to now. And so those things haven't emerged. And most of that 12.5, it was mostly parks, facilities, but the biggest chunk was for affordable housing, okay? So you took that action. That's the capacity that Councilmember Buffkin is referring to. Because the short time frame in the spring, that's why we didn't bring it back up again, because basically you have to go ahead and issue the 12.5 now. If you wanted to go ahead and direct staff today to bring back the 4.8 that's existing and increase that number for your meeting on March the 3rd, we can certainly do that. That would just require direction from the council.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, I'm of course interested to hear what my colleagues say with a parks bond and a housing affordability bond coming up this year. My personal preference would be we make this available for transportation improvements. I'd be happy to see the staff come back on the 3rd with some more details about that, but at least that would be my proposal for today.
If I
Any
may?
other?
Yes, I would be curious to know what else we might need the money for.
Right. So if I could, Mr. Cox, I think that's what leads us to the moment we're in, because that 2/3 bond capacity could be used for things that were under previous bonds. So park projects, affordable housing, and transportation are the big categories, or some facility work, which we used last year. But for your purposes, transportation, parks, and affordable housing. Do I have that right, Allison?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So you have that flexibility, and that flexibility means you have a lot of open choices. And so I think that's the question that, from a policy perspective, the council would need to provide us direction on.
Allison, do you have a breakdown of the 12.1?
Of the 12.5?
Yeah, 12.5.
Gosh, you know what? I don't have it here, but
We can get that for you.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can get that.
For purposes of the 3rd, would it be feasible to have options presented? I mean, obviously, if we're going to make it available, we would probably want to use it in the way that it's going to go furthest. So is it, are we able to say we could use it here and this is how far it'll go? We could use it here for transportation or sidewalks. This is how far it'll go. Like, do we have options, or do we have to designate the source now for it to be on the 3rd?
It depends on whether or not
I'm
you
creating
want
way too
Allison's
much
head to
work.
blow
For,
off.
okay.
What I would say is it would help us to give guidance. There are needs in all of those categories. And so ultimately, if your question is, can you justify spending the money on projects in any of those 3 categories, the answer is yes. There's needs in parks, there's needs in affordable housing, there's needs in transportation. So it's
it would help us help you if we could decide today where we would like to allocate it. So for the 3rd, we could.
She has to. It's kind of like the bond referendum piece. She has to write up the documentation for the meeting. So we weren't going to put this on the table. This is why we're in the spot. But it would to help us. Yes, I would say you would need to suggest transportation, and even within that, is there something you want to put it towards? Is it sidewalks? Is it major road projects? Is it traffic calming? And there's no problem from a technical perspective doing that today. I think the question is more the policy discussion. The choice is where the issue
And Councilmember Ruffin, what was your recommendation again?
Well, I was just thinking transportation improvements in general. Obviously, I've been thinking about this for a couple of days, and I've got some ideas, but I'm flexible on how it's spent.
What are your ideas?
Well, I think the sidewalk petition program in particular is woefully behind and overwhelmed with the interest from the community. Traffic calming is something I hear from probably most often from constituents in District A. People are just speeding through neighborhoods, and it's a very dangerous situation. And like I said earlier, the bigger picture of Parks Bond being on the ballot this year and a housing affordability bond on the ballot this year, it seems that transportation is the place where we could use the money now with more support coming in the other areas.
So I have a thought, but I want to hear others before I mention it. Go ahead. Scott, did you?
Yeah, but just one more question. Is there any downside to using all of our bond capacity? Does it affect our ratings or anything like that?
I would revise your statement 2/3 bond capacity, using all the 2/3 capacity. No, there's no downside.
Okay, all right, thank you.
If it's helpful, I have the breakout of.
Yes, what's the?
Okay, so a little over 5.8 million was for John Chavis Park and Crabtree Greenway structures. 400,000 was street improvements for a grant match for a bridge replacement. 4.7 is the housing, the affordable housing development, and 1.6 million was to support public safety, specifically the police facility, generators, and fire emergency vehicle operations course. I believe the study for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If that's helpful.
Is there anything within, I would agree with Councilor Buffkin that given the overall direction of the remaining bond discussion that we have in the remainder of the year, that providing this funding to the Transportation Department would be well suited, I think. Is there anything that we can't use this funding for within the Transportation Department? So for instance, something that I think we've all talked about quite a bit is greenways and protected bike lanes. But those protected bike lanes, for instance, tend to not be something that we have funded, have a large funding capacity for. Is that too in the weeds, and is that something that we can't put?
Generally, I would suggest yes. So the capacity for at least the GO piece is fairly open. And the way essentially the resolution reads, specifically if it's streets or transportation, it's for constructing, widening, improving, big, broad categories. Clearly, we've used it for greenways as well. So I believe that answer is yes, but that is a bit of a technical question from a bond council perspective. But broadly, I believe the answer to be yes. If that's helpful.
So I'm looking at our emerging trends slide, and I see where our citizens petitions is roughly 4 million. So if there was a motion to allocate the 4.8 to transportation towards, I think, closing that one gap there, I think that's something I know I could support.
Can I ask one question before we move? So this is not on the agenda, so I'm just interested in staff's perspective on, since we have to approve this for this year by March 3rd, which this is the day we'd have to do it.
So we're giving direction. We're not approving today.
I know, but we have to say move forward for the March 3rd meeting.
Correct.
This is the last opportunity for us to do that.
Correct.
So in other words, we are giving a policy direction that
Correct.
was
Direction.
was not on the agenda. So I'm just interested from the staff's perspective. I want to hear a little bit more from them. If this, maybe the manager's perspective, maybe this is the way you would like us to move forward with this available funding.
So that's a very good question, Councilmember Knight. So we had the capacity available. And so it was really a question of, do you want to introduce that question in January to the new council about what this is? Now, the reality is this 4.9 million ultimately falls away, and it's not actually a lose it per se. It comes back in future debt capacity, if that makes sense. So when we're talking about, remember that calculation at the retreat of the amount of existing debt capacity? I mean, this goes into our debt model. And so at that relatively low number, although sidewalk petitions are really important, we just made the determination not to introduce another topic, particularly related to the budget, when we only had until March 3rd. So to answer your question, is there a problem? Absolutely not. It's just a matter of you have to make a decision amongst a lot of different choices on how to spend that money. And we just made the call to say, well, we'll let it fall into our debt model and we'll pick it up again later. But it's 6, 1/2 dozen the other.
Can I add to your comment, or is someone else?
Yeah, and then we need to make a decision to move forward.
So I think that your idea is good, because I agree that we're looking at placing potential new bonds for housing and for parks. So allocating this last bit of debt capacity to transportation, I think, makes sense. I agree that there are a lot of projects. I certainly think we need more protected bike lanes, and our greenways need better funding. But looking at the amount we have to allocate, I think we should allocate it in a way that's going to have maximum impact. And using data to do that, and looking at the emerging trends, if we allocate this to eliminate the backlog in the sidewalk petition, I mean, that clears it out. So these are folks that have followed the process, gotten approved, and they're waiting years for to be constructed. And if we can allocate it there, we can make a significant impact in this specific area, I think. So I support that idea.
Okay.
If I may.
Quickly would like to echo, I think, what I heard Councilmember Knight say about process and being a little hesitant to move so quickly when there are so many needs in our city we heard from transportation, but we haven't gotten to 5 or 6 other items today that we have budgetary needs for. And so I'm real hesitant to move forward right now, noting that capacity will be there in future.
So is there a motion on the floor?
Well,
I had some
could
other
I just respond to Councilor Stewart very briefly? I understand, and I regret that we didn't all have more time to consider this. It came up when I got the agenda. I talked with staff a little bit, and so to the extent it makes you feel more comfortable, the question today is, do we want staff to come back for a decision on the 3rd? We could still decide not to do it on the 3rd. But if we don't ask them to come back today, we won't have the opportunity to decide on the 3rd. Do I have that roughly right?
Sure, we would prepare the documents under transportation improvements for that additional, the list she just described, we would add a line that says transportation improvements, correct?
There is the one piece, though, with the joint committee. The
right.
letter does have to be amended, and we are, unfortunately, already within the 45-day window. So that would be a little problematic if we got to
She's right,
March
that's right.
3rd, and we're not prepared to vote on the way the resolutions are worded.
Okay. Councilman Cox?
Yes, I just want to be clear that if we do this, do we really have to be that specific that we want to spend the money just on sidewalk project?
No, I'm sorry. What I was suggesting, transportation capital improvements is fine as a category for Allison's purposes.
Mm-hmm.
What I was asking or suggesting is if you want to be specific, and you could solve that question later within transportation.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking, is that we move forward, if we're going to move forward, that we move forward with it just generally for transportation and sort out the details later.
You can come back. Let me double check. We can say transportation improvements, correct?
The language, again, I think is going to be very broad, and we can capture what I believe the intent being discussed here, and then finalize the details as we work through. Because ultimately, this would also have to be a budget amendment. You spoke earlier about revenues equaling expenditures, so we would have to amend the budget.
Right, and in particular, we're still going to have a $13 million gap. And then, and also to Councilor Stewart's concern is these other areas that we have concerns for as well. Maybe we could just hold this until the end of the meeting, and after we hear from these other areas.
Well, I'm sorry, if I could,
Go ahead.
Mayor Pro Tem. Two things. There's really not going to be a whole lot of other capital items on this agenda.
Okay.
So just for foreshadowing. The other is, you could ultimately make the final determination as a part of your approval of the CIP in April and May. We can come back into your April work session and with this particular topic and give you some options if you want to take action on the transportation box today, if that makes sense. We can bring that back.
So just so everyone's on the same page on what I'm hearing and what's said, today we will have to decide, we have to give staff direction to allocate the money towards transportation. If we do not make that determination today, then it goes into a pot of debt capacity and we never get another shot at it. That's just the way it falls based on the timeline.
We do, it sounds like we do get another.
No, he said it doesn't. It goes in debt capacity. We can't use it for 2/3 again. That's exactly, if I'm wrong, please correct me.
Actually, you're both right. It falls into debt capacity, but, which is a general use, but then you'd have to have a bond authority in order
We
to
have to
spend
do
it.
another
You have to
bond.
do another bond.
We would have to do another
Something to look
bond.
at.
We couldn't allocate it in this manner. So,
Then,
It's amazing.
so
It's true.
if there's, unless there's a motion, I'm going to move on to the next item.
I'll make a motion that we use the 2/3 bond capacity for transportation projects.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and properly second.
Actually, I think the motion should be direct staff to come back on the 3rd with the use of the 2/3.
So corrected.
Okay.
You all know what we mean, right?
Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
The motion has been stated that the 2/3 bond capacity we will direct staff to come back with the ways it can be used within transportation. I think I surmised that correctly. It's been properly second. Call for question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Okay, it is a 5-2 vote. All right. We now move, I'm sorry, transportation, is that it?
Running up.
Okay, thank you all for that. I appreciate it. And thank you all who came to listen to transportation. We now move on to our next one, public safety staffing study.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. I'll take a moment to introduce this item as they get it prepared. Last year, the mayor and council authorized the staff to do a public safety study analysis for both police and fire. Both of those calculations and analysis are separate, given the different nature of that work. I do want to take a moment to say thank you to all the staff, not only in budget management services, but in police and fire and other groups that help work on the analysis. And today, the purpose is to present the results of the study. Now, let me encourage folks to not get too focused on the specifics of any one study one way or another. This is one of the tools that we have to provide data and analysis to help inform us of decisions among some of our most critical functions within the city of Raleigh. However, we don't make decisions by study. Study is a way of informing us, but there are lots of other variables that we were going to need to consider as we think about what is the potential recommendations and budget implications for this upcoming May regarding public safety staffing. So what I would encourage you to do today is to view this as information and general messaging, and we'll be happy to answer any additional questions. You don't have to solve the results today. This is just one piece that we're going to be using as we go through the budget process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Vigue to give you a summary and answer any questions.
Good afternoon, Mary Vigue, Budget and Management Services. As part of preparing for the upcoming budget, we review annually some data and key benchmarks. As we were going through the process last year, as our city manager mentioned, we reviewed the following data, and we realized that more research was needed. This chart highlights the general fund position count for Raleigh's Police Department compared to some of our peers, both nationally and within North Carolina. Raleigh's population grew by 8.16% from 2014 to 2019. That put us about in the middle of these cities. But Raleigh's Police Department grew only by 1.8%, or about 16 positions, the third lowest growth in this area. The next chart highlights the general fund position count for our fire department, compared to our peers, again, both nationally and within North Carolina. Our population grew by 8.16%, but Raleigh's fire department grew by 2.3%, 14 positions, the lowest growth of all cities that were presented. And so in response to this last year, we worked with the police department and the fire department and hired Matrix Consulting Group to review our staffing levels. The study involved reviewing all functions of the departments, conducting multi-year projections, and analyzing workloads. Today, I'll be providing a very high-level overview of the study and what our next steps are. I'd first like to start with an overview of each department. The police department's mission is that in the spirit of service, the Raleigh Police Department exists to preserve and improve the quality of life, instill peace, and protect property through unwavering attention to our duties in partnership with the community. This slide depicts the current high-level organizational structure of the department. As of fiscal year 20, the police department has 901 authorized positions. That includes 796 sworn and 105 civilian. And they have a $109.7 million operating budget. The map depicts the 6 police districts with 63 beats. The study highlighted that the police had 174,800 calls for service and 117,600 self-initiated activities. The mission of the City of Raleigh's Fire Department is unselfish, dedicated service. The department's vision is to anticipate and prepare while growing and empowering. The department is responsible for fire prevention, inspection, suppression, hazardous materials, and life safety education for the residents and visitors of the city. The department has 577 authorized sworn personnel and 45 non-sworn positions. The fire department has 28 active stations with 5 battalions and 39 frontline units. They respond to over 40,000 incidents annually, and for fiscal year 20, they have a $65.6 million budget. In completing the study, Matrix conducted employee interviews along with an employee survey. They collected comprehensive data regarding the organizational structure, resource allocation, workload, staffing levels, utilization, and deployment. They also coordinated with our planning and development services to understand development and future growth trends. They reviewed service delivery and resource options, which also included our support functions. As we move into the highlights of the findings, the report included strengths of each department. And so for the police department, the study found that the department had a robust community policing initiatives and a progressive and diversified approach to reactive and proactive investigation efforts. They noted that the internal affairs has a high degree of transparency and accountability. And the report also highlighted the department's documented strategic directives and how they frame our policing goals. The police study included several recommendations as it relates to structure, including scheduling changes in field operations, along with reorganizing detective divisions based on workload and span of control. Additional positions identified included field positions for greenways and transit, evidence specialist, and support for command staff and training. The report identified recruitment as a challenge and made future staffing projections based on population growth and workload. As we move into the report for the fire department, the study identified strengths of the department, including the fire's Class 1 ISO rating. The study found that travel times to emergency calls are within our industry performance standards. The department conducts 6-month and annual service on our apparatus, ensuring a high level of service on equipment. And the study also found that the public outreach follow-up that the department conducts after working fires is an industry-leading practice. Ooh, punchline. Ooh. Some of the highlights of the recommendations for the fire department include increasing personnel for field operations, specifically in our high-growth areas. It called for, the study identified the need for additional dedicated training division staff, which would free up field service staff who are currently serving as trainers. Recommendations also included additional resources for the fire marshal, quality assurance, safety reviews, recruitment, and administrative support. As with police, the report also included future staffing projections based on population growth and workload. So what does it all mean? So while the study identified some specific recommendation, it also included future personnel projections that are based on that population growth and workload. This chart depicts those projections for the next 20 years. So over the next 5 years, that represents 96 additional police personnel and 46 fire. Any changes in population growth, service demand, or delivery will affect these numbers. We are also working with the consultant on that tool that will enable us every year to revise these estimates based on a certain set of assumptions. So what's next? As we continue through the budget process, we will be working with police and fire in reviewing and developing a plan to operationalize the recommendations that aligns with the department's visions and priorities. It is important to note that this will be a multi-year implementation and that we'll be bringing back those recommendations as part of the manager's proposed budget. Will accept any questions.
First of all, thank you for the information, and I know we'll get real numbers when the budget comes from the manager, but any questions from councilors? Councilman Cox?
Yes. Just an observation, really. So it looks like we're spending a total of like around 170 million or so on fire and police.
Yes, sir.
And that's out of a $1.04 trillion budget.
Well, the general fund budget is about $550 million, and so that's part and parcel of it. The $1 billion budget also includes public utility, or Raleigh Water, which is supported primarily through user fees. And so when we talk about the percentage, that 170, don't make me do quick math, I'd be really bad, is about a third at least of our budget. So it's about of that $550 million budget.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Human Resources Benefit and Compensation Update.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem and Council, as Fagan Stackhouse gets the presentation prepared. This is a little bit as part educational and background and part foreshadowing some of the items that are important for us to talk about related to benefits and compensation for our employees. Before Mr. Stackhouse makes the presentation, I do want to take a moment to again say thank you to spending some time on this. While the topic may not be terribly exciting, it's perhaps the most important because it involves our people. And so people make a difference in our organization, and the compensation and benefit structure that goes with that is an important element of us being successful. Part of what we have to try to do is not only gauge the market in terms of where we are in comparison to other places that might try to recruit and retain employees, but also trying to look at best practices and are we doing the right thing for our employees. It's also by far the biggest cost element associated with the operating budgets. So we often talk about capital, but operating costs are something that occur year to year. And so it's really critical. It's also a very big number. And so this is a big part of the budget deliberations. And so it's important to spend a little bit of time on the background. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fagan Stackhouse to both educate you and enlighten you about the future.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mayor Pro Tem and members of the council. I'm Fagan Stackhouse, the Human Resources Director, and I wanted to spend some minutes talking about the employee benefits and then kind of switch gears and talk some about the compensation that we are looking at. And it's more of an outlook and some proposals for your consideration as we sort of work through the budget process. What you see here is a slide that represents our major benefits, and we have some very good benefits. I won't go into a lot of details on those, but certainly one that I would just kind of emphasize, and that has to do with the leave programs that we have. We've just added the paternity leave, and I think that's a cutting edge kind of thing, and you'll see in a lot of what we talk about how we move forward in a variety of ways to enhance our employees' opportunities to do a better job. If it's wellness or through our health center, all of those things are critically important. Here's some of the advantages that we would like to share. The competitive advantages are paid time off. I mentioned the paternity leave, retirement and pension savings, really good 3 plans there, the 457, the regular retirement plan, and the 401k. We have the Employee Health Center. I just referenced the health insurance, and I'll get into a little more detail on that, and wellness activities. But we do have some challenges, some rising healthcare costs for active and retirees. We've got to step back a little bit next year. Hopefully we can come back and talk about cost sharing, plan design, rising pension obligations. How do we address those issues as we move into the future? The health insurance, we have a third-party administrator, Blue Cross Blue Shield. We added also this year another component of Blue Cross Blue Shield, and that's Prime Therapeutics, and they're now dealing with our pharmacy. We have one card. I think the employees really like that, just having one card and dealing with just the pharmacy and all connected together there. The Delta Dental, that program is moving along very nicely. We have a self-insured program. We're large enough to do that on our health care, and the city is responsible for up to $285,000 in claims. After that, we turn it over to our stop-loss carrier, and they take care of it from there. And we don't get too many of these in a given year, but we do have some. This is a slide that really looks at how do we offer our health care. We have 2 plans. The Plan A is a little bit more expensive, and the Plan B is for the individual. It's a free plan. That's almost unheard of these days, but we do have a free plan. And we sort of articulate out how the deductibles work out of pocket and so on. The dental, the core basic plan, we do have a buy-up, which we have a lot of employees that buy up because they like the orthodontia and the dental implants and so forth. The health industry out there right now, the trend is 7 to 9%. The medical trends, 7.2%, and the pharmacy trend is about 8.3%. We do, and you'll see in a future slide here, that we are going to raise the rates for the employees a little bit, but we will take the burden of paying for the health care out of our trust fund, the increased costs. But we'll recommend no plan changes for 2021. And as you look at this slide, it essentially shows how the funds, or all funds are there, the health insurance cost has increased exponentially. If you step back to 2016 and look at 2021, that's a $20 million growth in the cost of health care. This slide shows the cost share, and we've been trending pretty much the same way over the last 5-6 years. For the active employees, we pay about 83% and 17% by the employee. For the retirees, we pay a bit more, 87%, with their 13%. Here are the proposed rates for increased, I should say, contributions, $2 to $32, depending on the plan selection of the category. For family, $32 in Plan A, Plan B, free on the individual, up to $22 for the family. And we're standardizing the non-compliance rates. For Plan B, we were at a lower level, $5 less. We're evening it out now, saying that rather than $45, all non-compliance would be at $50, as opposed to having a difference there. No proposed increases for the dental. They're just suggesting the Delta Dental that we utilize that more, but you don't hear that often. But it's really for prevention and getting the oral hygiene pretty well up to standard for all employees. And this would be effective starting January 1, 2021. Now I'm going to switch over to the compensation, a little bit more detail, a little bit more granulated, but certainly I think it's just a background that will help. We have 3 public safety plans, public safety pay plan. We have a broadband plan as well as a general step plan. These were established back in 2016. Let me just give a little background on each of those so you have a real context for those that are a little newer on the council. The public safety plan consists of fire and police up through the sergeants and fire captains. Now the command staff, they're in what we call our broadband plan. The open range structure that we have simply means that there are no steps or demarcations in those particular ranges. And this is what it looks like. We have a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum. And what you'll note is that the police sergeants and the captains, their minimums have been adjusted because we don't want to see as much overlap as we are experiencing between them and their subordinates. So we are adjusting for 3 years the minimums of each of those 2 classifications, the police sergeants and the fire captains. This shows the proposed plan that we have, and we've raised those minimums for the police sergeant and the fire captains by 3%, and we plan to do that 1 more year and see where we are, and do we need to continue with that. But we think that it will be adequate. Now to the broadband plan. This really takes care of all of those that are at the executive level, technical, supervisory, exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning no overtime when you work over 40. There are a few non-exempts in that plan, just to kind of keep this symmetry there with those people at those higher levels and in the non-exempt area. And I mentioned the technical, supervisor, managerial, and executives. This is what that plan looks like. The general plan is more than non-exempt. A large share of our employees are non-exempt, meaning that they would be subject to overtime, and is a current step structure. In a later slide, I'm going to talk about the need for revising it and some reasons as to why we need to revise that plan and create an open structure. This is what it looks like today. For fiscal year 20, this is what we're using, and you can see the various steps, the midpoint, and the maximum. Now, to kind of go into a little bit more detail on the general plan restructuring, the 40-hour conversion, we want to talk a little bit about the full-time market study that we do on a yearly basis, the consideration for range movement to reflect market changes. Now, what does that really mean? It really means that those pay structures that you saw, if the EPI or the cost of labor or the cost of living moves substantially, then we need to adjust our plans by a percentage or 2 to kind of keep up with the market overall. But we also look at the individuals and the various classifications, how those move as well. We also have been working now for literally 2 years on a part-time temporary study. And we think it's essential and necessary to propose that we move forward on a plan for that segment of our employee population. Here are some of the advantages and a few disadvantages for revising the general pay plan. It allows more efficient system administration. We have what's called a pay adjustment process and reclassification, and it's difficult if you have steps and you got to move someone to a step, which would cost more money to make those kinds of adjustments. We have organizational restructuring, and I think that's important to look back and see how best we can manage efficiently, and we would need that flexibility and not having steps to worry about. It allows the mayor to increase flexibility if necessary, but it's really up to the council to determine what the merit would be. Flexible promotional percentages. We've done that, tested it somewhat in the police and fire departments, and we think that is working quite well there. A couple of disadvantages, of course, the perception of loss of future pay predictability. I don't see those steps. What's magic about that to employees is that I can look and see what that might mean for what I can get next year or the future years. But just erasing the steps doesn't take away the commitment that we make as an organization in terms of what we will pay the employees. The temporary readjustment to the new pay structure, it's an emotional thing. We work with the employees and get them used to the change that does in fact occur. Here's a draft of what that would look like. Minimum, midpoint, maximum. Parallels all the other plans that we've shared. And it also reflects the living wage adjustment that the council has come up with, and we think it's a really, really good plan. And I'm going to have a slide on that in just a couple of minutes. But we'd want to maintain the 5% and the 3% merit. That can be done utilizing this open plan structure. Switching over now to the 40-hour week consideration. Historically and anecdotally, can't tell you where all of this started, but we do have employees at the 38.75 and also at 40-hour work weeks, sometimes working side by side. We feel this is the time, most appropriate time to go ahead and start working on that and addressing that, and both the general and the broadband employees. Our survey of the cities that we typically look at in some of the local towns here in the Raleigh area says that there's only 2 that are still not utilizing the 40-hour work weeks, and that is the city and county of Durham. So, including the state, 40 hours. And so we're proposing that we move to the 40 hours. And in doing that conversion, we would like to do it the beginning of the fiscal year, around July 1st, then adjust the 38.75 hours per week employees to 40-hour schedule. There are some that have counterparts, some working side by side, some at 38.75, others at 40 hours. We'd like to straighten all of that out. It will cost us some money to do that. The broadband employees are not impacted by any of the salary changes that we would propose. We will also convert the vacation and the sick leave days. If a person now earns in a given month 7.75 hours, would then add that quarter of an hour, raise it up to 8 hours, 1 day for the month. And we already have established for those 8-hour, 40-hour employees 1 day per month. And it's a graduated scale. The more years, the more that you can accrue. To do that, the total estimated cost between 1.6 and 1.8 million, and the variations there because we got a ways to go before we get to July, and those numbers could shift a little bit. And the majority of that cost is going to adding in that 1.25 hours each week to those employees that are not at 38.75 hours. Back to the living wage for just a quick minute. We have the City Council adopted back in January of 2017. And I think it's a wonderful effort, and we're moving along at a good pace with this. The living wage focuses on adequate standard of living. We have a universal living wage calculation that we've applied to this. And so we have progressed quite nicely from $28,620 when we first started in 2018, and we'd be proposing $34,130. From an hourly rate perspective, that's like $16.41. That compared to $7.25 at the federal standard, that's quite a ways away, and we think that this is a pretty good approach to manage the living wage for our employees. Another project that we've been working on is a full-time employee study, and the study results are, we have 85 benchmark jobs that we looked at this year. We're wrapping this up with 260 different classifications, and we used a peer group starting around the Charlotte and coming around to the Triad and then back here in the Raleigh area, and also the state. And so we took the midpoint and the market minimums and placed the classifications and employees based on if the market fell below 10%. We raised those employees up. And we have a number of employees that we have recommended, about 153, which is relatively low given our workforce numbers. But here are a few examples of moving to higher ranges. Engineering areas, obviously, code compliance has been low for a while, transportation, and we have some others. But we would plan to move them up based on a formula that we use to higher ranges, creating higher earning potential. Now to the permanent, part-time, and temporary employees. We have current conditions are we have over 3,000 part-time employees, mostly located in Parks, Recreation, Cultural Resources, and Raleigh Convention Center, Performing Arts Center, and the part-time jobs have not been reviewed since 2016. That's what, about 12 years. And the current pay rates are not competitive in the market. And we looked out there, all the others that we compare ourselves to are paying somewhere in the area of $8.75, $9 an hour and up. And the recruitment and retention has been challenging to hold on to those employees and try to get them to return year after year. So what we've done is created a classification and a pay structure for the permanent, part-time, temporary positions that do not have full-time equivalents. We do have some full-time equivalents. What I mean by that is we may have a temporary or part-time planner or HR professional or fiscal analyst, and we can link those to our current classification structure. But for all the others, we really didn't have a good system and a good process. We came to the council a few months ago and got the green light to go ahead on the permanent, part-time, and temporary definitions. Essentially, we would say we can create a 20-hour permanent part-time budgeted position or 30-hour part-time budgeted position with prorated sick leave, vacation, retirement, and if eligible, under the Affordable Care Act, offer health care. The temporary employees that are hired to work for a limited period of time, 999 hours. So what's magic about that? It is not. The state indicated some years ago that anyone worked over 1,000 hours, we would have to pay and make a contribution for pension, and they would also have to contribute. And we've been working under this proviso, and it seems to be working very well, but we would say in the future, temporary employees could work no more than 999 hours in a given year, can come back and work again the following year. The permanent part-time conversion. Here's what it looks like. The Parks and Recreation, about 106, 13 for general government, and then on through. So about 153 persons would be permanent part-time budgeted. And this would be at a cost of $1.3 to $1.6 million. The temporary employees, a lot more, around 2,514. The largest share of those people are in the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources at 2,369. Overall, the cost would be somewhere between $1 million and $1.2 million. Collectively, for the two, if we could do all of this, it would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.3 to $2.8 million. Now we look at, it's kind of a summary of the 40-hour conversion, what that would cost, somewhere between 1.6, 1.8, and then the permanent part-time dollars, we're looking at somewhere between 3.9 and 4.6 million. Now I ran through a lot of slides very quickly, and I can stop here and see if there are questions.
All right, any questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, to what extent do we allow our employees to be able to work from home or remotely?
We have a variety of ways that we can do that. Some people that have these office administrative type jobs, we will regulate that and ensure that they sign on. We can tell when they sign on and when they start working, if it's, utilizing the computer basically. And there are a variety of options that we allow departments to use and given that flexibility.
And the reason I ask is that, as you indicated, our healthcare costs keep going up. And like those who are working on a livable wage, you know, even though they get an increase, that increase only amounts to about $72, $73 a pay period. And out of that, if they have a family, they're paying an additional like $22 a pay period for healthcare costs. So if there's any way that we can reduce their expenses, like their travel expenses, by allowing people to be able to work remotely, I think that would help our employees tremendously. That's my only observation.
And we'll look into that and see if we can do more telecommuting as we've been increasing that, and employees, they come in with that idea, and sometimes we can arrange that even with the offers that we make as we hire them.
Okay.
Thank you. Specifically on the parks, part-time employees, I know that for several years it's been a particularly acute problem recruiting lifeguards. I assume that the lifeguards are within that 2369 there. And have you gotten into the details with the Parks Department? Do we think that'll help on our lifeguard situation?
We think that it will. The structure that we created would just allow for a lifeguard that comes back and returns year after year to make a little bit more than a new one, and we can be more competitive with some of the area community centers. And so we think that they have indicated to me that they can do a much better job of retaining and recruiting in those areas.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Fagan, a couple questions on wages. Full-time employees, are they all salaried?
Those that are what I call the broadband plan, they are the salaried employees. The ones in the general step and those in the public safety plan that I mentioned would be considered non-salary and would be considered non-exempt and subject to overtime.
So what's non-salaried mean? Hourly?
Hourly.
Okay. And then for wage classification purposes, what's the lowest wage classification for the city of Raleigh? You don't have to tell me the position, just what is the number? What's the amount?
As we propose, around $34,130.
Okay. And so, and then looking at the where is it? What I would call cost of living, but y'all call living wage. There's no minimum wage standard for the city of Raleigh employees, correct?
Well, that's
Yes.
what that is.
That's what that is.
That's what y'all, okay, and y'all call it living wage.
Living wage.
Well, I guess I'm looking at the adjustment. So when you adjust it every year, was it fair to say historically that's been cost of living adjustment or not?
It's a combination, and it involves the 40-hour work week. How much do you take home? How much is housing costing? What percentage in health care? So all of those factors come in to create that calculation.
Councilmember Knight, if I could help. The living wage adjustment is only for the employees that are at that lowest mark. So if they move up to this range, I believe they can also receive a merit adjustment, depending on whether or not
Yes.
they are where they are. So this basically just means there are no full-time employees in the city of Raleigh that are going to make less than this number. That's your living wage policy as adopted by the council. And the calculation is done based on that formula of housing costs and cost of living.
Okay.
You build that into your formula.
That was adopted in January 2017? Okay. So that's an ongoing...
It's adjusted every year based on the
yeah.
formula. Now, theoretically, it could go down, but we're not in a market where that's going to occur.
Yeah.
And does this hold for hourly employees as well as salary employees?
No. That's the other part that Mr. Stackhouse was going through in terms of that, haven't reviewed those since 2008. And that's different because those are folks that are truly part-time employees. As if you think camp counselors or like they just mentioned, lifeguards, things like that. Those are true temporary employees.
And more specifically, the beginning rate for any of our part-time employees will move up from $7.25 to $9 an hour and beyond.
And if I could add to that, if we can afford it.
Priorities.
So,
Mr.
yeah, sorry to do it. So I wanted to, I apologize for inserting myself. But, so what Mr. Stackhouse is describing to you is the HR study, the analysis, what it would cost, and those are some pretty big numbers to the general fund just for pay. And so how we potentially look at implementing this may or may not result in that occurring right away. In other words, that from the HR perspective, that would be your goal. Then Mary has to argue with him and decide whether or not we can afford it.
Right.
Those are, that's the challenge.
So, go ahead.
So,
before
well, I wasn't actually finished. Let me just, one question that led, so, the adjustment that's not automatic then, is what you're saying?
Yes, it is automatic.
But what do you look at if you don't think you can afford, then you bring back?
talking about the part-time.
We're talking about the part-time and the 40-hour conversion, because those would be in addition. So the living,
No,
the
go ahead.
living
I
wage
got
is
you.
already built in.
That's on the
When I
part-time
spoke to y'all
stuff.
at your retreat about
It's adopted.
the gap that we're currently facing, looking at next year's budget, all of that's already included. What's not included are things like a 40-hour conversion or the part-time study.
Okay.
Or some of these other things. But the living
good
wage
question.
is, it's a great question, is automatically included in what we look at.
Councilor Martin.
So, I want to. I want to hit on a few things. The first is that to Councilor Stewart's point about hourly employees, the fact that we're raising to 9, I applaud. But I just looked online, and when I had my first job in Pennsylvania, at the age of 14, I was making $7.25 an hour, and that was a long time ago. And so the fact that we're paying $9 an hour now and expecting people to be able to rise above and like have a savings account and like do something with their lives is so I to Councilor Stewart's point, priorities. And so I know that this is where we get into the budget conversations, and we have to figure out how to move forward. I think that is something that is extremely important to me, is that we need to value our folks. Something that I want to point to on page 6 of the compensation and benefits recommendations package that you sent over, which thank you for. The headline is Merit Pay Guidelines for Police and Fire Open Range Pay Structure. I was trying to do some calculations beforehand, and just wanted to hit on one thing that in 2019, the cost of the inflation rate was 2.3%. And if we're looking at the pay rate for a police officer that's at or above 53,987, and we're giving them a 3% rate change, that's really a 0.7% rate change after you adjust for inflation, which is $700. So again, we're moving in the right direction, and I applaud this effort. And I want to the point that was made earlier about the fact that we are not hiring enough police officers at the rate at which the city is growing. I know that we're going to continue to have that conversation as part of the larger budget negotiations as we continue. And I just want to highlight that this is important, and we can't lose sight of the fact that $700 take-home pay at the end of the year is not something that for most people, let alone people that are putting their lives at risk, is going to be something that keeps them in the job.
All right, Councilor Stewart.
I'm watching time as well.
Because you had a hard stop that you gave me.
I do have a hard stop, 6 o'clock, because I have 2 kids, which brings me to my point, which is maternity leave. Remind me what our current maternity leave policy is, and I think it's now parental leave, not just maternity leave.
Right. Parental leave, they get 8 weeks.
And that was updated.
I don't remember the exact time, but
About 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago.
Okay. Okay. And does is that prorated in any way for our part-time employees?
Not at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you.
One question. How many employees are impacted on the conversion from to the 40-hour week? I saw the dollar amount, but how many people, roughly?
I'd have to refer. I'm not sure if Allison can.
Or if you can get that to us.
Yes,
We can get it to you.
Yeah, if you can get that to us.
It's a lot.
As a
It's a lot.
follow-up. Yeah, that would be helpful, I think, for me.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I don't believe there's any action that needs to be taken on this today. I think we definitely need more conversation. I hear the concerns with part-time pay and things, but I think as a council, we need to have conversation. Because I met a great part-time employee yesterday at the convention center that also has another full-time job. So we have to think about some of those things. Not all are in that situation. Some are kids. So we just got to balance it all out. So if there's nothing else, I just want to say, you have anything? I just want to say thank you, and we'll move to our next topic of wholesale water rates from formerly Public Utilities, now Raleigh Water.
So as Kenny comes up, usually you hear from Raleigh Water in March, and they will be back in March to talk about their upcoming budget and water rates. But this is a slightly different topic that we usually don't address in the process, and so he's going to provide an update on that wholesale water rate.
All right. Mayor Pro Tem Branch and council members, my name is Kenny Waldrop, and I'm with Raleigh Water, as Mary shared. I'm an assistant director over the administrative functions. I'm here with our senior team members, Jennifer Alford and Stephen Balmer, together with Nicole Walper. They are a critical part of what we do every day, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank them. One of our roles is to support your director in the development of rates, fees, and charges. We also liaison with our partners, stakeholders, and peers, in this case, wholesale customers. So in that capacity, we bring you the final component of our multi-year cost of service study. Now, as part of the FY19 budget directives that we received from City Council, Raleigh Water was charged with developing a comprehensive cost of service study for its retail and wholesale water rates, its wastewater rates, and its reclaimed water customers. This was a bookend to the recently completed cost-justified report on water and wastewater system development fees. Staff were given council guidance to focus on the cost of service-based allocation model with a focus on revenue and rate stability within that model. Now, a cost of service study can have hundreds of elements, depending on how wide-ranging the study is. And we, as an organization, took a pretty deep dive into this data. So about mid-FY19, we realized we could not do justice to all aspects of the study without delaying some part of it. So we deferred the wholesale rate component until this year. Now, the city has 2 wholesale wastewater treatment contracts, one with the town of Clayton for 1 million gallons per day, and another with the town of Middlesex for 240,000 gallons per day. The city also has a wholesale water contract with the town of Fuquay-Varina for 750,000 gallons per day. Now, although we had some abbreviated cost of service studies in the past, focused on retail rates, first in 2009, then again in 2014, this was our first comprehensive study that included wholesale rates, and it's been over 12 years since we've looked at the wholesale rates model, and we learned some things. For example, although the volumetric component of the wholesale rates have been increased in line with and commensurate to the retail rates, this was insufficient to keep up with both capital and operation and maintenance costs associated with certain key infrastructure that more heavily influences the wholesale rate. We call this phenomenon rate drift. So this is the structure of your wholesale rates. We selected the utility method of wholesale rate calculation for this exercise. It's a method that is used by investor-owned utilities and for publicly owned utilities that want to develop rates for outside entities like wholesale customers. This provides a rate of return, may also be known as a method of return on investment for certain utility structures. For sewer, there's an operating component billed volumetrically in CCF, or 100 cubic feet per billing unit. There's a monthly surcharge associated with the pretreatment services we provide, a monthly surcharge for each of 4 key pretreatment parameters, and a monthly capital component that is billed, like the base charge in our retail rates, regardless of usage. For wholesale water customers, the rate structure is simplified to an operating component billed volumetrically in CCF and a reoccurring monthly capital component, just like the sewer wholesale rate. So in FY20, Council implemented some of the recommendations from our cost of service study by increasing the pretreatment charges, which were applicable both to retail industrial customers and to our wholesale sewer customers. The biological oxygen demand surcharge decreased, the total suspended solids surcharge increased, the total nitrogen charge surcharge decreased, and the total phosphorus surcharge increased. With the completion of this wholesale rate review, which was attached to your packet, we are recommending for inclusion in this year's budget an elimination of the pretreatment surcharges, an increase in the sewer operating component, an increase in the capital component that will impact both the town of Clayton and the town of Middlesex. We are also recommending a decrease in the wholesale water operating component and an increase in the monthly capital component. As of early last September, we telegraphed these proposed rate increases to our peers in Fuquay, Clayton, and Middlesex, with a caveat that our council had not seen them yet. So our wholesale customers have had some time to digest these changes. We are also proposing that all new contracts be term limited, more so than they are today, and that we use a new, simpler billing structure that makes it easier to apply and understand the rates. This would be applicable to all facilities except the Little Creek Resource Recovery Facility, which has an unusually high existing and replacement cost value. Special pricing to be determined in a future date is warranted for that facility. So our recommendations are an acceptance of the wholesale rate study with a stated exclusion for the Little Creek Resource Recovery Facility for future capacity pricing. We also recommend that you direct staff to include these new rates in the proposed FY 2021 budget ordinance with a policy statement limiting new wholesale contracts to short-term leases. In the audience is Ms. Melissa Levin, a representative of our financial consultant, and we'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for the presentation. Any questions? Any recommendations?
I recommend we approve the staff's recommendation.
All right, it's been moved and properly second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, motion passes. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, so let's take a flavor of the room here. So there's a couple of things left, and so we could just have Mary speak through those two items. One is the Blue Ridge Corridor Study presentation, and the other is the upcoming contracts associated with DRA and Hillsborough Street. What's your interest level? Where are we?
I was going to ask, have you all had a chance to even look at any of these yet? Are there any known questions? All right. If you could, I would say, at least for the sake of the record, give a summary of these. And I don't believe today there are any action items that are needed, so this is for information.
It is solely for information. So the first item is we're bringing back the report on our Blue Ridge Corridor Municipal Service District study. If you recall, last year in August, we were directed by council to do a review to look to see what the options would be or what it would look like if they were to incorporate into an MSD. And so the report is attached along with a presentation that will give you more detailed highlights, but it basically outlines what a municipal service district is, what services can be provided, and then options for different areas based on various studies that have been completed previously. It also shows you what the impact proposed tax rate could be and the impact on both businesses and homeowners. That was a very quick update on that.
Do we know if any, outside of Blue Ridge, our existing MSCs, or if any of them will be asking for any type of scope increase?
Well, that's the next topic, which we're actually getting ready to go through the RFP for our other MSDs. And so they might be coming back as part of their proposal for that, but also remember, they, like the city, have gone through reevaluation, and so part of theirs is a revenue neutral tax rate. And so one of the options, they may come back and have a discussion with city council about whether to go to a revenue neutral tax rate for those districts or whether to apply that increase. So that will come back as part of the budget discussion as well.
Okay. It sounds like everyone actually, you've reviewed this, and these presentations are in the backup and on board docs for those that want further information. Any questions about these at all?
So I do want to highlight on the MSD, sorry. Blue Ridge, we've also did present that to the Blue Ridge Corridor Alliance last week, and so they are familiar with the information. In terms of MSD and the RFP, you will see this item on your March 3rd agenda for your evening session, because part of the process is to gain feedback from residents and business owners in the district, and so that night we'll be hearing public comment under your public hearing section. We also will be sending out a survey to those addresses both in Hillsborough and downtown to see what categories are still important to them, and all that feedback goes into putting the RFP together. And so that will come back as part of the budget process at the end when we make our recommendation on that award. And remember, that's all required by state law. This is the second time we've gone through that RFP, and the first time, I believe, was 4 years ago.
Okay. And also, so everyone knows, the RFPs for our existing ones will be received and evaluated in April. Yes. Contract is selected, and we have to have a vote done by July 1st. So the public hearing is in June, but the MSD contracts must be in place by July 1st.
Correct, and we typically are bundling them in the budget process, so as we bring that forward. Do you want me to hit the last item on the agenda really quick? So the other one is, we started doing this last year, is just attach items for council information. And so the other item on there is, it's that time of year where we solicit feedback from our residents. And so this is, while it is not a scientifically based survey, it is something that we send out and work with the community to just get, based on your key focus areas of the strategic plan, just to get some feedback for what's important to them. What do they see as their high areas? We ask them how they would spend $1. Again, it's not very scientific, but it helps us when we come back in April and begin to think about the proposed budget of where the community sees it. We're working with our partners. We have posters and surveys that will be in all of our rec centers. We've worked with Raleigh Transit Authorities, so they'll be also flashing this in the buses. There's a host of million other ways we're getting the word out there to our community, but it will launch on March 1st. We'll bring all of that information back to you at your April work session.
And can we also work with our MSDs for first night and make sure they have information out during first night in March?
Yes, sir.
So that we can reach people as well?
Oh, that's the other part. In Raleigh Water's bill, it will be there as an advertisement in March as well. So it's something different we're doing too.
And I just have a question. It looks like you can complete the survey by mail or in person here?
Yes.
There's not an online option?
There is an online option, and it's also available in English and Spanish. There's a link in the memo, you'll see it, and we'll blast it out to you. We'll put it in one of your Friday updates.
Okay, the bottom of our memo just says complete the survey in person or by mail.
You mean the actual paper survey?
Yes.
That's just a copy of the paper survey.
Okay, but there is going to be an online option.
Oh, there's definitely
Okay,
an
thank
online option. We would encourage people, because yes.
And I'm sure we will also tweet this out.
Yes, lots of social media with it.
All right. Any other questions, comments? I do want to remind everyone in the public that this coming Saturday is our Mayor Unity and Celebration of African American Culture at the Raleigh Convention Center from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. It's a two-part, so if you can't stay for the whole day, you can at least get one of the parts in throughout your day. So please come out, everyone. Again, just want to send that reminder. I had the flyer, but I left it rushing here. Anything else? We are adjourned.